I'm Beth Gugino. I'm the vegetable extension plant pathologist at Penn State. This is the 9th time I've presented at this meeting. I've been at Penn State almost 10 years now. So first, a quick question. How many of you are here so you can get a category credit? A few hands, okay. I'm here. I need category credit, so I'm here too. How many of you are here because you have issues with bacterial diseases in your tomatoes? All right, okay, so I think everyone's going to win something from today. So I've set up this presentation to also be a little bit of a discussion. You know, I kind of always say what I think the best management practices are for managing these bacterial diseases, you know, and I'm trying to work with them, you know, in my research trials. But you're dealing with them on your farms, and so I'm going to, at several points, ask for you to share what strategies are working for you in terms of how you're managing these diseases. But before we get to that, just some of what the common bacterial diseases are that we're dealing with in tomato. So we have bacterial spot and speck and bacterial canker, which are the ones that we're primarily going to be focusing on today. The next one at the bottom there is tomato pith necrosis. It's also a bacterial disease. It's Pseudomonas corrugata is the pathogen. And it causes a yellowing and wilting and kind of causes this black streaking that you see on the stems. It's a pretty distinct symptom. And then when you cut open these stems, you'll start to see a laddering of the pith. This pith should really be nice and green and solid. It shouldn't have these separations here. Typically, it's a plant here or there. It's pretty common in high tunnels. It's not something that's going to wipe out a field or a planting, but it is something that we do see. It's associated with cool nights, high humidity, cloudy weather, and excessive nitrogen. So that's just another one to kind of be aware of, that we diagnose it on a regular basis each year. But really, I'm going to focus on these top three. So bacteria get into the plant in a number of different ways. They either enter into the plant through these natural openings in the leaf. So in this case, this is a stomata. So this is a natural opening that allows the plant to respire. So the bacteria can naturally get into there. They can get into wounds, obviously, any kind of wound. We might not see the wounds, but if you have windswept sand, heavy rain events can create these small wounds that the bacteria can easily get into. Hydrothode is another natural opening, the guttation of a leaf. Those water droplets along the edge of the leaf, if you imagine you have bacteria on the surface of that leaf, they get into that water droplet and then they're actually absorbed back into the plant. They can also get in through nectarothodes. So again, natural openings here that those bacteria are really small, different ways that they can get into the plant. Bacterial spot on tomato, we probably see, I feel like we see bacterial spot a little bit more here in Pennsylvania than we see speck. Spot, the lesions on the fruit are much larger and corkier. I think some of the bacterial strains that have become more prominent in our fields are more aggressive, and so these spots are becoming more aggressive and larger. The lesions on the leaf are fairly nondescript. And often they can look a lot like early blight when it very first starts. So it's small dark spots. They kind of expand a little bit, but more what happens is you get an accumulation of a lot of those spots, and then the leaf will blight down. Bacterial spot is caused by a number of different species of Xanthomonas. And so the one here that I have highlighted, Xanthomonas gardneri, is one that we're seeing a little bit more frequently. It's one of the ones that's a little bit more aggressive. These also can go to pepper as well. Bacterial spots favored by moist conditions in warm temperatures. So in a warmer summer, we tend to see more bacterial spot in our fields. In a cooler summer, we may start to see more bacterial speck. So spec prefers these cooler 64 to 75 degree temperatures, again, wet, humid conditions. The lesions on the fruit are much smaller, more spec-like than spot-like. So that's how you distinguish them. The lesions on the leaves, I have colleagues that say that they're able to distinguish them just based on that leaf symptom. I really can't. They look pretty similar to me from a foliar symptom. It's really when you get down and see these fruit that you can kind of distinguish. You can distinguish them a little bit better. And you can have both on the same plant. They're not mutually exclusive. Then we have bacterial canker, our third bacterial disease that we deal with. This one is also favored by warm temperatures, wet conditions. Bacterial canker is different in that it runs systemically within that plant. So because it's running systemically, you also can get a vascular discoloration with it. And then rather than getting a leaf spotting, you get a marginal necrosis around the outside edge of that leaf. And then on the fruit symptoms, you have this bird's eye spot. So it's more white on the outside and kind of tan or brown in the center. We can see bacterial canker also on pepper. It's something that I haven't really talked about a whole lot, but every year, these last couple of years, we've been getting 1 or 2 samples that have been coming in on pepper. So again, with peppers, you do get a little bit of this marginal necrosis again, and then you get that very distinct kind of bird's eye spot on the fruit. So again, something that's not running rampant, but something to keep in mind that we have seen it a little bit in pepper. You can test for bacterial canker on your farms. There is a test from Agdia. It's an immunostrip test. And what it allows you to do is you collect a leaf sample and you put it in this pouch. And in that pouch is a plastic grid. And that grid you roll, like use a rolling pin or a head of a hammer, and you basically abrade that leaf tissue so that the sap is then released into this bag. And then you put this little test strip in that solution, and you either get 1 line or two lines. So the top line on the test means that the test is working. It's a positive control. If you get a second line at the bottom, that means the sample has tested positive for canker. And so these tests are about $5 a piece. So if you're having a lot of trouble with bacterial canker on your farm, this might be a worthwhile investment just to try on your own. When we get samples into the plant disease clinic, this is actually a test that we run to confirm whether or not we're seeing bacterial canker. So it is an option, if you are having significant issues. So where do these bacteria come from? Usually they're introduced into the farm through infected seed or infected plants. And so this here is a cross section of a tomato seed. So when you look at a tomato seed, they're very hairy on the outside. So that's what you're seeing here. You have then the seed coat layer, and then you have this embryo inside. And those bacteria can be on the outside of the seed. They can be underneath the seed coat. They can even, in some cases, be in that embryo. And all of our seed treatment techniques are not going to rid bacteria that may be in that embryo. So that's just something to keep in mind when we talk about hot water treating seed and some of these other treatments. These bacterial diseases are becoming more, or we're seeing them more often because we're shortening our tomato rotations. So rather than waiting 3 or 4 years between rotations, we're going back in every couple of years. And so, sanitation becomes really important. These bacteria are associated with crop residue. Once that crop residue is thoroughly decomposed, these pathogens can't persist in the soil for very long. Another challenge that we have is that they're very difficult to detect at low levels, and so our detection methodologies are not sufficient enough to get all the way down and make sure that the seed is completely clean. So we know that 1 seed in 10,000 seeds can be enough to create a field level epidemic throughout the entire process. Another challenge is that transplants we can grow them for 6 to 8 weeks with absolutely no symptoms associated with it. So really, I think about managing these bacterial diseases, you just need to assume that they're going to be a problem. Because just because you don't see symptoms doesn't mean that you're not going to have an issue then when you go into the field. Great news, right? Everyone's really a positive, aspirational talk so far. So, I know. You know, so when we're thinking about managing these diseases, and I know I've showed this slide, a number of you have seen this slide before, but really it's this integrated approach that we really need to be thinking about. And if you're really someone who's having these issues, you really need to step back and critically think about what steps you're taking in the production throughout the entire production chain. So we know the bacteria can be associated with the seed. We know that we can spread them during transplant production. Transplant production is an ideal case situation for moving around these bacteria. And then when we get out into the field, if we actually see symptoms, it's really kind of too late. There's nothing that we can do to really cure when we start to see these diseases. So it's really about being preventative, and then if you have an issue, thinking about how you're going to change your production system for the next year to try to reduce losses.
That slide. Back to that. A testimonial?
Sure.
You were asking for...
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's a great slide.
Okay.
Okay. What I'm going to do, if someone has, when Beth gives another option, I just took it. This slide is so important because it shows the different places where you can attack the issue. For instance, just real quick testimonial from what we do on our farm. Right here at transplanting seedling, you can do an Actigard treatment, possibly. We have done that. It's very, very simple. It's a little tricky because we had some damage from Actigard. Sorry, Syngenta, or whoever has it now. But up here after seedling production, we actually put some material in our transplant water. If you think about it, anything you can do to alleviate the stress from any stress. So we're using regalia in our transplant water, and also starting that treatment a little earlier. I'm just telling you what we use. I'm not promoting regalia necessarily. Yes, sir, Jonathan? What rate? Catch me afterwards. I'm not the guy that does it, so that's a disclaimer. I just tell you what they do. Thank you. And check with the regalia guy too. He would know. Sorry. But real quick, look at this picture and know that somewhere along the line we're going to have to do something. And this is, I've seen where one big rainstorm has blew a field up. John, you know that. And and then what do you do? So we try to do something before that. So there's plenty of seats up front here if y'all want to sit. Standing is good too. Sorry, Mr. Cameraman, I'm on the floor again. Beth.
Okay. All right. So we're gonna work our way kind of through this production cycle, and then at periods of time, I'm gonna stop and let you guys comment on terms of what you're doing on your farms. So with seed, there's a number of different seed treatments that we can use. So there's a hot water seed treatment, which is effective for bacteria and fungi, effective for the surface of the seed as well as that seed coat area, so just underneath that seed coat. Clorox treatments are good for bacteria and seed-borne viruses, only good for the surface of the seed, so it's not going to penetrate underneath that seed coat. We have hydrochloric acid, which is good for bacteria, again on the surface and under the seed coat. And then trisodium phosphate is for, again, seed-transmitted viruses. But what I said before, and what's noted on this slide, is that none of these are going to impact any bacteria that might be in the embryo. So with heat seed treatment, and I'm going to be giving a presentation this afternoon in the organic section, and I'm going to have all of the heat seed treatment equipment set up if you're interested in learning more about the specifics. But basically it's a sequence of temperature baths for specific durations. So you're basically taking the seed to the brink of its life and then bringing it back. And in that process, then you're killing the fungal and bacterial pathogens that are associated with the seed. You can use window screens to make pouches. You can use coffee filters to make pouches to do that treatment. Here's the different temperature and time durations for these different types of seeds. So here's tomato, 122 degrees for 25 minutes. is the actual the killing temperature. If you don't go high enough in temperature, it may not be effective. If you don't go long enough in duration, it might not be effective. So these are pretty specific time and temperature durations. In working with some growers, they've started moving to, rather than using these water bath systems, which can be pretty expensive, there's a sous vide. How many of you are familiar with the sous vide? Couple hands. So this is used for cooking. It's used for bringing meat and fish and different things up to a base temperature, so that then when you pull it out of this plastic, it cooks very quickly. So they use it in a lot of like high-end restaurants where if they're trying to cook a lot of steaks all at the same time, it brings up that baseline temperature. But the thing that's important about this is that these are really precisely temperature controlled, and that's what we need in the process. So just to put water in a pot on the stove and try to manage it with a cooking thermometer isn't going to be precise enough. That temperature is going to fluctuate quite a bit. And so these sous vides are significantly less in cost than the scientific water baths. Clorox treatment, the biggest thing with this Clorox treatment is making sure that you have a surfactant in there. You need to be able to break that surface tension. So thinking back to that cross-section of that tomato seed that I showed you and all those hairs, well, all of those hairs make that surface really hydrophobic. And so you can basically get a huge air pocket around that seed. So even though you're treating the seed here, there's air pockets around everything. And so you're not really getting that contact that you need between the sodium hypochlorite and the surface of the seed to get that treatment in there. So what are your best practices for seed management? There's microphones up in here in the front, or Ken can run around with a microphone.
We'll try it without me.
How many of you are hot water treating seed? Okay. How many of you are thinking about hot water treating seed? Couple of hands. Those that are hot water treating, do you feel like it's made a difference? Anyone? They're nodding their heads. I can't see that far. Nearsighted.
Is this more for like buying like organic? Organic seed or heirloom seed? Because from our like if we buy from like one of these commercial seed companies, it seems like they have.
That started
really loud.
That's all right.
I can repeat it too.
It seems like if we buy from the big seed companies, a lot of them say they already did these treatments.
Right.
And so.
That's a good point. So it's really important before you do any of these types of seed treatments that you really read that seed packet and make sure that it hasn't been treated, the company hasn't treated it prior, because you don't want to have a second treatment. Yeah, so we're organic seed, heirloom seed, but really any seed that's not. The other caveat is it can't be like pelleted or coated. It really needs to be raw seed that then you treat after the fact. Any other best management practices for seed? Okay. Move on in the process. You see where I'm going with this, right? So greenhouse sanitation, and I know I've shared this with this group before. You really cannot be too clean when it comes to greenhouse sanitation practices. Those bacteria can survive in weeds if there's weeds in the greenhouse, if there's organic debris around the greenhouse. They can survive in wooden structures. So if you have wooden benches, things like that. You really need to think, and you're having a chronic problem with these bacterial diseases, you really need to think about, do I want to keep these wooden structures around, or do I want to move to having more metal and things that I can clean? So really, sanitizing all surfaces is really, really important. Like I said, eliminating weeds. Consider what you're doing to treat your transplants. So, you know, are you just overhead watering them? You know, are you putting any copper applications on them? In the greenhouse, it's one of the few places in transplant production that we could use something like agromycin. You know, we're not able to use strep out in the field, but it's something that could be used in the greenhouse. There is a phage, bacteriophage technology that could be used and has been successful in greenhouse settings as well, or even something like oxidate. So again, what you're doing is you're assuming that there's bacteria that were associated with the seed, and you're growing these really dense flats of transplants, and you're going to assume by the fact that you're overhead watering that you're splashing these bacteria around. And again, you might not see it in those transplants while they're in the greenhouse. It may not manifest itself until you're out in the field. So you need to be thinking about what steps you're taking in terms of production in the greenhouse. And maybe you're like, oh, I'm not growing my own transplants. I'm outsourcing them from somewhere else. It's important to have a conversation with who's ever producing your plants in terms of what practices do they then have in place to try to minimize risk associated with these. And this is just what the bacteriophage are. So these are actually viruses that are very specific to bacteria. So they're very specific to bacterial spot, bacterial speck, bacterial canker. And what happens is these phage will actually land on the bacteria cell. They'll inject its DNA, replicate a whole bunch of times, and then cause this bacteria cell to lyse and basically die. So it's replicating itself and killing the bacteria in the process. This has become adopted pretty heavily in Florida, where they have a lot of issues with copper resistance within their bacterial populations, especially in greenhouse production. In the field, I think these are still really sensitive to the effects of the environment, so I don't think we have a good sense of how they might perform in the field, but in more protected environments, they can be another tool in the toolbox, because we have to use them all. So minimizing leaf wetness, you know, allowing drying cycles between watering so those plants don't stay wet. Roguing out flats. Roguing is really important. You know, if you have a flat, this is flat of tomatoes is littered with bacterial spot. You know, if you have this flat that's showing symptoms, you really need to get rid of that flat and all of the flats around. So you can assume that those bacteria have moved from that flat and have spread around. So, management practices in transplant production. Anyone have anything they'd like to share? What's a strategy? What's a strategy that you use when you're growing your transplants to try to minimize bacteria?
Don't be shy. Easy for you to say, right? Mm-hmm. Someone had a hand?
Oh, there's one up here.
Again?
Just give a lot of air movement, keep them dry.
Yep. So increased air movement, keeping them dry. A lot of these pathogens, they require that leaf wetness in order to infect. They require high humidity.
I would suggest not going in there on the benches with your feet.
So the suggestion was not to go into the greenhouses or get on the benches with your feet. Yep. So general sanitation. Anyone else?
Is there any effect on, okay, I put my seeds in a flat, then I pull them out, and I replant them in my 32 cells.
Mm-hmm.
Good question.
So, yeah, so I plant my seeds in my trays, and then I transplant them, because it saves a lot of space, and then I transplant them into 32s. Mm-hmm. Would it be a big advantage to putting the seed in the 32s so I don't touch them again?
That's a good question. So the question was, you know, do you transplant into larger cells or pots to begin with, so you're minimizing the number of times you're physically touching that plant, you know, as you're moving to larger containers? That's a good question. I'm not sure. I mean, I would think that, I mean, if you're doing something like that, you would want to make sure that the plants are dry when you're doing it. And I would think that, you know, periodically it would be good to, you know, wash your hands and kind of wash the tools or anything that you're using throughout kind of the process at a periodic time points, because then you're, again, minimizing that if you're moving stuff around, you kind of clean up, then you're going to reduce moving it throughout the entire system. So,
On sanitizing your greenhouse with Oxidate, do you think that's the best to use, or do you recommend something even better than Oxidate? We use Oxidate, and it seems to do a fairly decent job, but I'm not 100% happy with it.
mm-hmm. So the question was about the efficacy of Oxidate in terms of sanitizing. I mean, I think that that's one of the good ones that's out there. To keep in mind with a lot of these sanitizing products is they will kill whatever they come in contact with at that moment. So there's really no residual activity with it. So when you're using those, you have to make sure that you're getting kind of good coverage in terms of How often would you apply something? I mean, I would follow what's on the label in terms of how frequently something like that should be applied. So something like Oxidate applied to transplants in this transplant phase, what it's going to do is if bacteria got spread around and you apply Oxidate, it's going to kill the bacteria that it comes in contact with on that surface of the plant. So then you go in and you water again, you're minimizing the chances of spreading it around further. So one more and then we'll have to keep going.
Think about oxidating after you have them planted out in the field, especially if they say it's going to rain really, and we oxidate before that. Do you recommend that?
So the question is whether or not to apply Oxidate after transplanting, say if you're anticipating a significant weather event. I think I would be more inclined to maybe make an Oxidate application after a significant weather event, because basically you're buying that plant a little bit of time to try to heal up any kind of wounds. But that's not going to be a silver bullet by any means. And coverage is really important, because again, it's only going to kill any bacteria that it directly comes into contact with. So, one more, and then we got to keep moving.
I just wanted to add Oxidate. The label recommends that right after the rain.
Right.
You got dirt splashed up or whatever thing to oxidate.
Mm-hmm.
I've done that pretty effectively in my situation.
Okay. Yep.
Plastic is, you know, got dirt on it and everything. Yeah, right after the rain.
Okay, right after a rain. So, okay. All right. So in the field, we want to make sure that we're rotating our crops. You know, if you feel like you're having increasing issues with these bacterial diseases, you know, maybe spreading out those crop rotations a little bit is going to be important. We've already talked about minimizing leaf wetness. So same reasons you would try to minimize it in the greenhouse, you're going to try to minimize it in the field. Often with tomatoes, we have multiple plantings. So thinking about how you're moving around the farm between those plantings is important. You know, are you going, you know, in the morning you want to go and pick your older plantings. While you're picking those, you know, you can be covered in bacteria, and then you go work in your younger plantings. So you need to think about kind of the sequence of events and how you're moving about the farm. Even processes of staking and tying. You know, those stakes and stuff, you know, as you're tying, you're creating wounds with the string, you're creating wounds as you maybe break some of those plants. It's important to do that when the plants are dry. It's important to think about maybe taking some sanitation steps as you're moving between plantings or between rows. Again, reducing risk that maybe there were some bacteria on some of those plants. Okay, I'm going to kind of clean things up and then move on. And that way, in case I spread something, I've had this sanitation step in place. So using only clean stakes and equipment, we know where this is going next, right? How many of you reuse your tomato steaks? Okay, yep. How many of you clean your tomato steaks before you reuse them? Okay. How are you cleaning your tomato steaks? Clorox? Steam? Both? Anyone?
I'm using rebar now, so I went from wood to rebar. I used to dip the wood in bleach, but you gotta leave it in there for like hours.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm hoping the rebar now, the rust is constantly getting rid of everything.
Do you recommend
Wishful
treating the
thinking.
rebar?
Hmm?
Do you recommend grading the rebar? Because I treat my rebar.
I would treat rebar too. I would treat really anything. You know, bacteria are really small and they can survive on surfaces of a lot of different things. And even rebar, you know, there's going to be cracks and crevices that it can get into. And we know that the bacteria survive well over winter. Now heat, so steam heat or dry heat can be a really effective way to treat steaks. I would really suggest if you have an issue in a field, that you don't reuse those steaks. You don't try to clean them up. It's one thing if you have a field that you didn't really have issues in, you know, you clean up those steaks and you use them again the next year. If you have a problem in a field, is it really worth the risk of introducing the bacteria then when you reuse those steaks?
You don't think you don't think the Clorox will do the job on it?
Clorox will do the job. The thing you have to keep in mind though is that Clorox treatment is a sanitation step. So if there's a lot of organic matter and debris associated with that steak, when you go and then treat it, it neutralizes the solution and it's not doing anything. So really you need to kind of power wash the steaks, get them clean, and then sanitize them. So, burn them. I was in a meeting the other week, and I asked the same question, and everyone said they burn their steaks after every year. I think that was just to appease me. So, yeah. All right. So we've kind of talked about that in terms of steaks and stuff. I kind of need to keep us moving. But that it really is. I mean, thinking about, again, if you're having chronic problems, we've seen situations where even header tape, 15 minutes, that even header tape, so there's a field that had bad bacterial canker in it, and the grower reused the header tape, and that next year they saw a canker right along that row where that header tape was. So things to keep in mind. You know, why are these problems? Why do they keep chronically reoccurring? You know, it's really important to step back and think through the entire production process. What am I reusing? You know, between fields, things like that. So in season, you know, there aren't that many tools, especially once we start to see bacterial diseases develop. Really, for tomatoes, products are most effective. You want to be protecting those fruit when they're small. So they become infected when they're small, and then they develop, those symptoms become more obvious as those fruit ripen, become larger. Bacteria will get into natural openings and little bits of wounds. Those populations will increase, and then eventually you'll see symptoms. There's kind of what we call it a latent period between when it's infected and when you actually see the symptoms. So really focusing applications early when those fruit are small is important. Come on. Copper is still a good tool for managing these bacteria. I know in certain parts of the country there's definitely concerns about resistance, and there's a lot of copper resistant strains. I think in Pennsylvania we're not quite at that point yet, but what happens is that the copper ions actually denature the proteins in the bacteria and cause them to die. So it's a contact reaction. So you have to have the copper there, and you have to have good coverage on the plant so that if those bacteria, then you have a rain event and those bacteria are splashed onto the plant, that copper is there and released and is able to kill that bacteria. So coverage is really important with these bacteria. Copper fungicides, I should say. Ken mentioned Actigard. Actigard, probably, how many of you are using Actigard? So a few more every year. There's a few more hands there. It's been around for a while. There's been a lot of research that's been done with this, and so what Actigard does is you're activating the systemic acquired resistance of the plants. You're basically you're activating the plant's defense response, their immune system per se. They don't really have an immune system, but you're activating their immune system, which then makes them a little bit more resistant to these bacterial pathogens. Not a silver bullet at all, but another tool in the toolbox to try to minimize losses. And so, you know, something like Actigard can be applied in the greenhouse and then can be applied in the field at multiple points. It's not something that you see symptoms and then go out and spray Actigard. So it's something that's part of a preventative strategy. Obviously, because you're boosting that plant's immune system, boosting the defense responses, that takes energy. So there have been cases where there have been issues with yield drag with it, because you're basically, you know, the energy that the plant is using to produce fruit is then put into kind of a defense response. And so if a plant is stressed to begin with and you use something like Actigard, you could see some type of yield drag. So when you read labels, you can see that there's increasing rates as those plants get larger later in the season. There are new products now. Lifeguard from Certus is a relatively new one. There's a number of other ones that, again, you're kind of looking at the plant defense system. The most data, though, is supportive of Actigard. Yeah. Let's see, what else? Come on. There are some other things that can be recommended. So Tanos, K-Phyte, Regalia, Quintec. Quintec has a 2EE label for bacterial spot. Again, another tool that could possibly be used. Copper tank mixed with mancozeb, though, a lot of times is just as effective. When you look through all of the different trials that have been done, Mary Hausbeck in Michigan just did a whole series of trials looking at what can be applied in the greenhouse and following it up with what can be applied in the field. And she had a copper mancozeb program throughout the whole season, and that was the most effective for her in that situation. So it's really trialing and seeing what works for you. Really, all of those preventative strategies are really what's important. So what do you do in the season? What are you using? Well, I already asked about Actigard. How many are relying on copper? How about copper and mancozeb? And Tanos? Anything else? Crossing your fingers? Hoping it stays dry? Right. So yeah, so if you put in oxidate applications in there, it's going to basically sterilize kind of the surface of that plant, reduce the bacteria that are there on the surface that it comes in contact with at that moment of contact. So. And then come back with a preventative. Yep. Anyone else?
I'm struggling with canker. I think I'm so aggressive with that, spot and speck don't even exist anymore. So I guess one question is, are other guys having trouble with that more than spot or speck? Rebar, steam, Clorox. You know, when I started spraying out of high school, you didn't put the first spray on until you had golf ball sized tomatoes. transplant treat, first week, every 5 to 7 days, tweener sprays of regalia, Quintec, trying to survive. And I guess one of my questions is I feel like we're coppering them to death and we're almost hurting our leaf tissue. 1 year I say I'm just not going to use any and see what happens. I don't have the stones to do that. And then vector, I'm an orchard guy also, and I feel like orchard guys with nightshade and other species around, I can't, it's so gray area, I can't guarantee it's in the seed, the greenhouse, or whatever. I swear it's being vectored by thrips or aphids, or, I mean, for me anymore, it's not a what if. For the last 7 or 8 years, it's a win.
It's a win for canker.
Yeah, and it's driving me crazy, you know? So that's one thing all you smart people tell the breeders, canker, 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 late blight is no big deal, I don't care about that. Breed, and I understand these bacterial issues are probably insanely difficult to breed for, but there ought to be able to, we all have produced in the field, and you see varieties that are super sensitive and a little bit tougher. Let's find them markers and start breeding it, because we're going to die as tomato producers if we don't go down that path. And then let's get some studies in the field to see an orchard guy with nightshade under his apple trees versus a guy that's in the middle of nowhere in corn and beans with no weed pressure and vectoring from bugs. Those are some of the things that are just driving me crazy that I don't, you know, as an industry, we need to try to sort it out. I can't figure it out.
Well, and I think that's, you know, you make a good point with the insects and moving, you know, moving these bacteria around. You know, they can passively vector things. So that, you know, if there's bacteria that are on the surface of those plants, they can pick up those bacteria and move them around. You know, we're seeing that with bacterial wilt and cucurbits. So I wouldn't imagine it would be the same thing in this scenario. Do others feel like you're having more issues with bacterial canker than spot and speck? Who's having more issues, feels like they're having more issues with canker? A few hands? Yeah. Yeah.
What am I doing wrong?
So that's a case where, you know, it's sitting down and like I can sit down with you and we can try to think through where in this cycle can we try to break things.
I use rebar we have for 20 years, and we'll steam clean them, get all the residue top to bottom, you know, spinning 4 or 5 at a time, soaking them in the Clorox in big tubs, and I did that for 7, 8 years, and I'm still getting it. So I was like, well, I'm not doing that anymore because it was a waste of a lot of man time, you know.
Okay.
I think you got to assume that it's in the seed, and you got to heat treat, especially after last year. I think that it's in the seed and it's everywhere. And everybody.
And my greenhouse has been doing that for years.
Yeah. Yeah.
You said it could be one tomato seed that's bad. So it's like, you know, if we get seed sometimes that's coated or whatever, and you know you need that seed. What do?
Right.
You know,
right.
You're gonna put it on the bench with all the other seed. And you're just hoping, cross your fingers, try to do everything right, and still everything can go wrong just like that, you know.
What stage of the crop are you seeing that canker come in?
All the above, all the above. I mean, I've started to read a bunch of research, and you're starting to see more, like Cornell's doing some work on canker. And I've seen it from, I mean, they say it needs a 5 to 6 week incubation period, and I've seen it a week in the field. Like when you're putting that first spray on when you go to the field, I'm like, uh-oh. You know, you see one little, I call it, if you're an apple producer, it looks like fire blight on apples when it goes quick. You know, you get the right 50-mile-an-hour wind front and rain blowing when that plant's tender.
Yeah.
5 days later, that one little scaffold is burnt back like fire blight in apples. And then when you see that, now I know, get that plant out, burn it. Don't. And it used to be, for me, it was, we pruned whenever we were finished thinning peaches. We didn't watch, you know, if the suckers got to be 4 inches long, it didn't matter. Now it's man, they are pruning when they are little tedious things. I'm coppering before pruning. I'm oxidating immediately after pruning. I'm putting 15 to 20 sprays on them. You know what I mean? It's driving me crazy. And I swear it's because of my orchard and nightshades, or I don't know, but
yeah.
I'm not chasing thrips around and dissecting them to prove it.
And all the way in the back.
All stages. The answer to that is all stages.
Yeah.
From 2 weeks in the field to I got 70% off, and then all of a sudden the wrong thunderstorm, and you go, uh-oh. You know, you got these half-dead plants off of one side.
One more question.
Yep, all the way in the back.
Is there any chance that canker's in the irrigation water if you're using surface water? Because I've had the same problem. I've never had a spot speck. I can keep the canker at bay until we're starting to harvest pretty much, but then it always starts in a low spot in the field and spreads from there, and it spreads fast.
Yeah, yeah. No, I think irrigation water, surface irrigation water, could potentially be a source. Yes.
Is that test? I'm sorry, I'm talking out of context. One more, wait. Sorry. Is that test that I'm going to get that this year,
yep.
so I can verify it quicker?
Yep.
I'm pretty experienced with it now. I pretty much know. But would that test work on surface water, or what is the? No,
you would need to do. You need to do plant tissue or something like that with that one. Yeah.
Is there something that can check surface water for pathogens?
Well, I'd have to look. I would have to look into that for specifically with canker. We've done it with some other pathogens. Either you bait it out or.
I'm not pulling out. I mean,
so,
you know, it can be 5 different ponds depending on where I'm moving around. Mm-hmm. Doesn't seem to matter.
So, all right, Boots.
My experience, I had always had a little bit of canker, a little bit of speck spot. We've gone to trickles and we've gone to plastic, and it still seems to be there. I mean, I thought the overhead was costing it, but in my opinion, I've gone with 5-year rotations. I just think it's in the seeds, and we just can't. Yeah, maybe buy a new farm, maybe because.
Yeah.
No, I just did buy it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, we gotta move on. Yeah, I think I just have a couple. So obviously, you know, these diseases take an integrated approach, and I wish I could come to you some year and be like, here, just do this, and you won't have any kind of issues. But really, it is thinking about it throughout that entire production cycle. I just want to let you know we have Extensions kind of redone their website this year, so you can get information here on vegetables from our website. We do newsletters and updates. I have a 1-800-PEN-IPM hotline number that I leave voice messages on in terms of what diseases we're seeing across the state. I'd like to make a plug for the new production guide. So 2018, there's a new production guide. We have copies for sale here. We went to a whole new single column format, and this is what it looks like. So here is tomato, and I know this is small for this size room. A single column format, bacterial canker, bacterial speck and spot, bacterial wilt, which we don't deal with here. But all these tables have a lot more information in them now. So we have the FRAC code numbers, the product name, the rates, the active ingredient, the PHI, the REI, bee toxicity is all in one spot. So rather than having to move around and look at different tables within the guide, we've kind of consolidated it into this single table type of format. So I really encourage you to get the new guide. I know none of you have them unless you already bought it this morning, because they were just shipped. So I encourage you to get that. And so that's all I had for this morning. So.
Give Beth a hand. Yes.